Lesson 38 is about ratio problems. In these problems you'll be doing some word problems, and they'll deal with similar proportions, and you'll have to solve for a missing part of those proportions. Now, a ratio, that word just means fraction. A proportion, that means fractions that are equal to each other. They just look different. For example, 1/2 is proportional to 5/10. And so one way that you do these ratio problems, watch this. If you cross multiply, so multiply these two numbers and these two numbers, you'll see that they are equal to each other. 1 times 10 is 10. 2 times 5 is 10. That's a property of proportions. You can cross multiply them, and those products of the cross multiplications are equal to each other. So these word problems that you're going to be doing, they'll give you a ratio of this thing to that thing, and then they'll give you another value. There'll be a missing part to that. For example, maybe one of your ratios was 1 to some unknown value x, and then they gave you that was proportional to 5/10. So you could cross multiply this to solve for the unknown. You'd say 1 times 10 is 10, and then that equals 5 times x. Divide both sides by 5, and you'd see that x equals 2. So in these problems, you'll set up a proportion, or in other words, two ratios that are equal to each other. That's what proportion means, and then you'll solve for the missing part in those two ratios. Now, just so you know, cross multiplication, all it is a shortcut of the multiplication rule when you're trying to solve for an unknown. For example, look at our 1 over x equals 5/10. If I was trying to solve for x, one thing I could do is first multiply both sides by x, and that would cancel my x's on the left, and then I would end up with 1 is equal to 5x/10. And then I could multiply both sides by 10, and I'll go ahead and do that. And so now I have the 10's canceled on the right, and I have 10 equals 5x, and then that gets me back to x equals 2. Now you see that took a lot longer than just doing the cross multiplication. So that's all cross multiplication is. It's a shortcut using the multiplication rule, or a shortcut of the multiplication rule. Let's go ahead and do a word problem. Let's just read it through first. It's always what we do with word problems, right? Is we read them through first one time. And this one says, in Galveston Bay, the ratio of trout to flounder was 10:3. If there were 50 trout, how many flounder were there? Well, we're trying to find out an unknown value. That's almost always what we're doing in a word problem, is trying to find out an unknown value. And so we just go back through and we try to set up an equation that will help us solve for that unknown. And so it says that the ratio of trout to flounder was 10:3. And so we could go ahead and write down that ratio of 10/3. And then there are 50 trout, so how many flounder were there? So there's a proportion here. We could try to solve for this unknown amount of flounder by setting up a proportion. And so we could say is equal to 50 over what? And so we'll just say F for flounder, because we don't know how many flounder there were. That's our unknown. 10:3, that's going to be proportional to 50 over the flounder. Remember, proportions, those are just fractions that are equal to each other. So now let's go ahead and cross multiply here and solve for this. We'll say 10 times F is 10F is equal to 3 times 50, which is 150. Now if we divide both sides by 10, we'd end up with 15 flounder. So F equals 15. That's our answer. So to solve that problem, we had to recognize that we had proportions that we were dealing with here. They told us a ratio of trout to flounder of 10:3. So that told us that if we had one more value that we knew, we could set up a proportion to solve for that unknown. And we knew that there were 50 trout total, so we could figure out the unknown amount of flounder, and that was 15. Let's do one more. Let's just read through this word problem first. In the Agekik River, the ratio of sockeyes to coho was 7:2. If there were 350 coho, how many sockeyes were there? So we know we have a ratio problem here because they tell us a ratio of sockeyes to coho, and that's 7:2. So let's go ahead and write that down, 7:2, and let's set up a fraction that's proportional to that. And so we know that there are 350 coho. We have a ratio of sockeyes to coho. So 350 goes in the denominator here. Make sure that you put things in the right place. The question is how many sockeyes, so we'll just say S for sockeyes. The ratio is sockeyes to coho. That's why we have S over 350, because we were given how many coho there were. So now we just need to cross multiply, and so we'll have 7 times 350, which equals 2,450, and then that equals 2S. And so we just divide by 2, and we get 1,225. That's how many sockeyes there were. So to solve these ratio problems, you just need to set up two fractions that are proportional to each other. One of those fractions will contain an unknown value. You find that by doing cross multiplication. And all cross multiplication is it's a simplification of using the multiplication rule. Okay, well that's all for lesson 38.